Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the class play after the draft. Tej and I were together in Detroit, as many of you know if you watched along, and now we are back in our respective homes, ready to cover the post-draft period. Tej, tell us about the draft and tell us about kind of the recovery of 3 long days of covering the best prospects in the world for football.
I am so glad that we got to hang out together at the draft with Ben Brown, Sean Syed. It was a really, really good time. As I said on Stats and Scheme yesterday, like I was really surprised by how many people in the Metro Detroit area showed up just to see someone read, a couple names off of a note card. But it was still like an awesome experience to be down there. Being in the media room with you and Ben and Sean and seeing you guys cook and as we kind of follow along with Eric and Thomas's live show, and then on Friday doing a little bit of work at the beginning of the draft, and then being able to head down and really see what it looked like was also a lot of fun as well. So anyone going to Green Bay next year, or I think Pittsburgh is rumored to be the year after that, like would definitely recommend the experience.
Yeah, I'm excited and I really love Detroit Tage. I mean, there was good food, good people, obviously the football people going on, all kinds of fun people to be around, great talks, great discussions, and obviously a lot of young men made their way into the NFL over the 3 days of this weekend. But we are here to kind of give a sense of how to grade process in the post draft period. Tej, kind of walk us through, like what are your general approaches to how to draft and then kind of how to evaluate that?
Yeah, so I mean that is a really good question, and I think when we think about like how we would do a draft if we were running a team as a general manager, like we are really big on the wisdom of the crowd's approach. So I would definitely take into account my scouts' inputs and my draft models, but it would start with the prior of what your ranking is on the consensus big board, and that's really where I would start with the draft, and then I would move players up and down depending on all the other information I'm receiving based on whether there's certain red flags about a player, or there's a player that's like undervalued and shows up really well in our analytical models, or a scout has identified. Like I would definitely take as much information as I can into account and really try to have a methodological way to go about like putting together a draft board. And how I really evaluate a draft when it's done is I look at a couple things. I think the trades that you made, especially if you're picking up future picks, should definitely be included in your total compensation from the draft, as well as like, did you hit some of the easier things to hit on? Like in the first round, did you try to take a premium position if you had the roster availability for it, and there was the player availability for it also? Did you try to move back at times when you had the opportunity to? Like all of those things that I think can really be taken into account when measuring how GMs draft.
Tej, I think that was a fantastic summary. And I think if we want to boil it down a little all the way to the rules or, just generally the draft facts about the draft, I think our listeners could kind of get a leg up because folks, as you know, the draft is really governed by the CBA and the collective bargaining agreement that the players reach with the team, the owners, and Roger Goodell at the league office. And so, Tay, some of the key draft facts that I think are just good to start with are number one, there are predetermined number of picks in the draft. That there's complex formulas. Typically, it's one per team per round. Then obviously people trade and back and forth, and there's some compensatory picks, which our colleague Eric Eager has written very diligently about on our website. And then I think something that goes kind of over people's head is there's also a predetermined list of players that can be selected in any given draft. And I think that a lot of people kind of think of the draft as more of college recruiting, where there's so many high school players playing high school football each year that are available to play college football that there's kind of a the base rate is pretty close to how many good quarterbacks there's going to be and how many good running backs. That's not necessarily the case in the NFL, because there are a predetermined amount of players, and the threshold is a lot smaller because there's only 32 teams rather than 100 or 200 college FBS and FCS and so forth teams. And so you're really limited to who is going in the draft, and you can kind of see that change a lot because Tej, this year we had 6 quarterbacks go in the first round, and in previous years we had just Kenny Pickett go in the first round of the draft. And that makes a huge difference in the value of the draft. And kind of to that greater point, those predetermined players and those predetermined picks, they also have predetermined salaries, Tej. And so how do you think kind of the salaries, given that, we're dealing in this confined space by the rules where the picks are set and the draftees are set, how does the salary kind of play into it?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there is a rookie wage scale where when you get drafted, you kind of have a set structure to your contract that you're going to be able to play on. First round picks get 4 years plus a possible 5th-year option that is on the team's discretion on if they want to pick it up or not after your 3rd season. And then any other round after that will just get the standard 4-year contract that they will play on, for at least their first 4 years. And sometimes that gets moved around because of suspensions and stuff. But I think the thing that's like pretty under discussed in the public NFL discourse is how steep the rookie wage scale is, especially compared to performance curves, but even just in general. When you look at like the 2023 rookie wage scale, the number 1 pick, which happened to be Bryce Young, was going to get about a little over $40 million total on his entire 4 years of his rookie contract. When you go down to the number 5 pick, you're already at $30 million. So you already have a $2.5 million drop. You get to the number 10 pick and you're at $25 million. So another drop there in regards to like how steep that is. But then like you keep going throughout the first round. And by the time you get to the middle of the first round, most players are getting between $14 and $16 million over the course of their rookie deal. So you're talking about a number 1 pick that's going to be making around $10 million a year, whereas the number 16 pick is only going to be making around $4 million a year. So a $6 million difference per year, which does add up over the 4 years. And you even look at just the signing bonuses this year. So like what is guaranteed, and the Bears will be giving $25.5 million in signing bonus to Caleb Williams, while the Vikings will only be giving $12.7 million to JJ McCarthy at number 10 overall. So you're also getting half of that value as well, which kind of creates that advantage where if JJ McCarthy is 50% or greater or better, more productive than Caleb Williams, he's going to be generating more value per dollar on his contract.
Right. And when you're talking about that, you're talking about surplus value, which has been a very well-studied thing by economics professors, by draft analysts, and so forth and so on. And when you consider that surplus value, obviously it takes several years to reap said surplus value, but it really comes down to your valuation on draft day. And that takes us into some key assumptions that are kind of abstracted away from, the facts, the hard facts of the CBA or the hard facts of just the reality of drafting. But they're assumptions that obviously can be tested and probably have some flaws here or there. But in general, I think it's a good approach from an analyst point of view as a third party who's someone who's not in a front office to think of. And I think the first one, Tej, is that no team knows any other true valuation of any given player. So you look at 2 players this year that kind of show the flip side of the coin here, Tej, and it's like Bo Nix. A lot of people going into the draft said that the Broncos loved Bo Nix. And so a lot of people valued him as, at the 12th pick in the draft, just because they thought the Broncos would pick him. That was kind of like give or take the over under. But there was less understanding of Michael Penix's true valuation in the draft. And so he pops up at 8 and it's a shock, but clearly the Falcons think they can reap some type of surplus value there, whether that's this year or in 3 years or something like that. And so that fluctuation in valuation is what causes a lot of the differences in how we look at the draft at the beginning. And obviously those two players are at the top of the draft and they're quarterbacks. So the surplus value has much more variation there. But then you look at the back end of the draft, and the reason why the consensus big boards or the mock draft EDPs or something like that are substantially different is because of, similar to that curve, it gets a lot flatter towards the back end of the draft. And the expectation of how those players and the valuation of those players, it kind of flattens out. And so then you have teams that may think they're getting a huge steal, or teams that think they like someone's dropped to them or are passing on several players because they don't want to see them anymore. And that could cause up to like a round going down. And then finally, kind of based off of that valuation, the kind of assumption that I like to take is that coaches have a predetermined scheme which will minimally change based on the players that they draft, and free agency is before the draft. So obviously they already have an idea of what free agents and players that are coming back from the year prior will slot in. I think a great example of this is how Patrick Mahomes was drafted, middle of the first round. Then all of a sudden he sits for a year, and his second season, he becomes the best quarterback in the league almost immediately. But it took kind of a year to realize that a scheme could be built around him. They had the right players in place, so forth and so on, to realize that he could reach that top potential. And so a final piece, which I think is really one of the easiest pieces to grade, Tej, but we'll focus on the assumption right now, is we don't really know actually what any given selection for future years will be traded to or from us because of performance. And that kind of deals with that steepness curve that you were talking about, right, Tej?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think when you look at just the sheer uncertainty in the draft, and you can go through every single draft of the past couple of years and almost always find a player who was taken in the top 10 who scouting reports had as labeled like a high floor or maybe even a can't miss prospect sometimes, that ended up not working out in the NFL. And there's so many reasons for this. Sometimes you're taking a player who might have spent their entire life in like a 30, 50 mile radius. And they have to all of a sudden transfer to a new city they've never been to before. Scheme also plays a huge role. Like you mentioned, like some players are either drafted by an old regime that changes over after a year and are put into a scheme that they might not be fit into, or even the current regime that drafted them, the current coaching staff, didn't know necessarily like how to best utilize their skill set, or the player himself, for a couple of reasons, like doesn't end up working out in the NFL. Like there's so many changes that happen when a player goes from college to pro that it makes it really hard to predict.
Yeah, and I think a great example of that is the Bears this year, where they trade back. The Panthers trade up. They swap kind of first round picks. The Bears decide to go with first round pick later. That's their major addition. And they add DJ Moore, who we kind of knew the value of. We knew he was probably a top flight receiver. He obviously played extremely well this year. But they felt that was a fair value, plus some other pieces. And now all of a sudden they're sitting at the first pick in line to get Caleb Williams, where last year, Bryce Young didn't perform up to that standard of what you would want to see from a first round pick. And the Panthers were one of the worst teams in the league. And so it just, there's so much variation on what can happen in any given year, especially in an injury laden game like football, where, a first round pick could be substantially more valuable if it's in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, rather than if it's back in near that second round and where the curve kind of starts to flatten out. So now that we've kind of settled those things, we can really get into meat and potatoes, Tej. And you kind of, to summarize what we've done so far with the assumptions and the facts of the draft, there's really two things that we kind of want to grade here when we're looking at how a general manager or a staff or even the coaches as well play into their duties on draft day. And the first is player evaluation, which we've discussed kind of a little bit earlier on, which is really hard to grade because, we know how well people perform but we don't know kind of the backgrounds of what went into it, including injuries and personal reasons and all these other stuff. So as a result, it has this long grading period, basically until a player gets their second contract, which can happen 3-4 years later, particularly for first round picks where there's a 5th-year option. And so, you don't really know how well you've drafted until 5 years later. And who knows, given the short terms of general managers' seats, how, if they'll be there, if the coaching staff will be there. There's a lot of turnover in the NFL. So player evaluation, really hard to grade. The second is pick management, which is really easy to grade because we have an idea of how valuable each pick is, and that basically is locked immediately after the draft ends. So starting out with the harder one, because I think there's more meat and potatoes there to kind of roll through from a high-level analyst perspective. Tej, tell us a little bit about how we can apply some player evaluation just using the wisdom of the crowds that you talked about right after the draft ends.
Yeah. So again, like you mentioned, player evaluation is the toughest thing and probably all of football, especially projecting it from college to pro. But if we do use the wisdom of the crowds approach and then kind of compare that to where players were actually drafted, we can glean some information from it. So the first thing, the high overview is just like the actual position that the player plays. And there's players taken in the first round that will inherently have more value than players or than other positions, just because of the position that they play. Where if you're taking obviously a quarterback, but positions like offensive tackle, receiver, anything on the defensive line, cornerback, those have a better chance of generating that surplus value for you than positions like linebacker, running back, or offensive guard, just because of what they're paid on the open market and how often those positions actually reach the open market at the top of their position group. But then the other thing that happens when we're looking at the residual or the difference between where you're actually taken compared to the consensus big board is whether or not you were a steal or a reach. And really good research by Timo Riske at PFF and some other people have found that when a player is taken past their consensus big board ranking, so they fell in the draft further than we would have thought, they are more likely to live up to their actual draft position than their consensus big board ranking, because that is multiple teams in the league telling you that they don't see this player as highly as the public sees this player. And there could be a lot of reasons for this. There can be medicals, there can be character concerns, combination. But that's what's happening when steals happen. When a reach happens, that player is more likely to live up to their consensus big board ranking than their draft position, because it only takes one team to reach. And when a reach does happen, the chances are that player doesn't have any of those concerns because the team feels comfortable, taking them ahead of where we expected them to. But even though that they were taken ahead of there, the wisdom of the crowds is right here in a sense where they will most likely perform like their consensus big board ranking.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up because that kind of became a flashpoint this week with Fox Sports' Nick Wright talking about Howie Roseman. And I think we'll get more into how the Eagles approach the draft in our second segment where we're talking about pick management. But one of the things that he said is that, you're looking at the steals, quote unquote, that the Eagles get, Tej. And a lot of times those are guys who are dropping and the Eagles stay tight to the consensus big board and probably have a little bit different valuation of how these players are. And so you end up with some pretty good players like Jordan Davis, who's performed pretty well, but is like, a 2-down player, a bigger guy. And then you have some people who don't play as well. And that's kind of how that goes from there. But the kind of concept from a higher level that you're kind of introducing here, Tej, that I want you to hit on just a bit before we kind of talk about a little parts of this, is that it's really hard to have a good draft, but it's really easy to identify when someone had a poor draft. And so you look at some of these, and the reason why that is you look over history, basically back until 2013. Our friend Arjun Menon, who's on the show last week, or this weekend rather, has put these together. Like in terms of the actual like goodness of drafting, GMs have really struggled to get over like the 60th percentile on average of outcomes of players. And so tell us why, like, we kind of outlined why it's hard to really have a good draft or a good draft over be a good drafter, but why it's easy to identify, if there's something wrong with the draft.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a good point there where it's like, I think it is really hard to be a good drafter just because of the sheer variance in each pick. Again, like going back to the chart that we're referring to that we can post on Twitter, like there's GMs, even the top GMs, Bill Belichick, you look at our own Thomas Dimitroff, Brett Veach, Mickey Loomis, the Will McClay, Jerry Jones combination in Dallas, like that's the top five. They've all had their draft misses. Sometimes it happens in the first round, sometimes it happens in the second, but like you can point to any of them and find out, find some particular draft misses. But I think when you look at the other end of things, you can have like a not sound process in the draft and be considered like a bad drafter. Just because it's kind of easier to reach on a bunch of players, and take a lot of these players ahead of where they're supposed to go, or be the team that takes players with these bad medicals or bad character concerns, and like that doesn't work out for you. Like there's so many avenues to mess up a draft, whereas I think the avenue to get a draft right, you need a lot of things to happen, but it's still easier to see in your mind how you can have a good process, even if the results don't turn out exactly how you would hope.
Right. And you start using this word process. And I think that's what a lot of people who may not follow the analytics closely, but maybe really great at scouting or something like that, kind of get confused about, because, you're a big Lions fan, and Brad Holmes kind of brought this up in the pre-draft, but there's like this idea of we just want good players on our team and we want players who fit the scheme. But as we've kind of outlined, and as I put in a quote tweet that I just put out sharing our stream, it really doesn't end up in the long term that way. Like it's really difficult to get over the 50th percentile. And so as a result, kind of the teams who have seen a lot of success in the draft have built this kind of process of pick management, Tej. And so there's a lot of good conversations here that have a lot of good research by people in the community, including discount rates, including trade charts, including future outlooks on drafts and stuff like that. And so, Tej, walk me through kind of generally how a team would probably approach a trade chart and how that would allow us to grade the team's draft, or at least their management of picks, that second element that we're talking about.
Yeah, there are a couple ways to approach a trade chart. I think that when you take the players taken at each slot in the draft, you can map it to a couple things. If you have some type of all-encompassing metric, like a wins above replacement or WAR, approximate value (AV), which is like what Pro Football Reference uses, like you can use kind of like those metrics to kind of see like what each draft slot is going to be from a expected WAR standpoint. And I think that's like one good way to go about it. Another way is to use what the league tells us about these players, which is like their second contract value. So you'll have a little bit of a less sample of that because you have to start from the 2011 new CBA until now. And a lot of players taken recently like haven't gotten second contracts yet, but like that's also another way you can go about it. But the overall conclusion of a lot of these trade charts is that the Jimmy Johnson curve is too steep because it was based off of the rookie wage scale in the late 1900s. And that's a lot different to what the scale looks like now, but also just like kind of how these players develop over time, and the confidence interval being so wide for a lot of these players that are taken. So that's like kind of a way to get the expected value of each selection. But then you can also factor into the trade chart what the rookie wage scale is for each of those spots, and you can get projected surplus value. And so that's really where this comes into play. Stuff like Ben Baldwin has done, or Timo Riske again at PFF has also looked at, like, if we take what we think a player's actual value will be over the course of their 4-year rookie deal, and then we subtract what they're actually being paid on that rookie deal, how much surplus value are we getting at each slot? And this is where like the loser's curse by Richard Thaler and Cade Massey comes into play, because you're taking these players at the top of the draft, top 5, especially if you're taking a non-quarterback in the top 5, and you're putting them on one of the more expensive contracts at their position, and you're hoping that they can live up to that expectation. Whereas when we see that big rookie wage scale drop off past pick 10, if you're taking a player there that is, has a 40 to 45% chance of becoming as good as the same player at the position taken a couple spots earlier, they're getting paid half as much amount of money. So if it ends up not working out for them, it's a lot easier for you to manage versus taking a player in the top 5 that ends up not providing much value for your team. Oh, I think you're muted, Sam.
It's interesting to see how teams approach those two things that you said, Tej, surplus value and like just looking at the trade charts and the Jimmy John and the difference in the trade charts, because you picked up on something quickly this year in which it seemed as if the Eagles were making moves where like the trade charts were a little different, like maybe they're using a different trade chart than someone else who is trading with Jimmy Johnson. And that's a real place where people can kind of pick up on value when literally you're kind of convincing your partner in the trade, or not convincing, maybe it's just two different approaches or two different timelines, that they are winning a trade and you think you are massively winning a trade, Tej. And so it's really interesting. Are there any other kind of evaluations that you can see like that?
Yeah, I think like the main question, and like this is like a point I wanted to bring up with you, is like if you look at like a lot of these surplus value charts, like the one that Ben Baldwin has, like it would tell you straight up that like pick 12 is going to provide more surplus value than like pick number 2, especially if you're taking non-quarterbacks or quarterbacks at that position. Like if you were in like a draft room and you were explaining to the GM, like, yeah, we do see pick 12 just having more value than pick 2 because of the rookie wage scale and our projections. Like, how do you go about kind of like explaining that?
Yeah, and I think Jake here has a good point, and I think it's a good point to walk into an explanation of the actual trade charts. But he says, should we talk more about trades in terms of the distribution of possible outcomes rather than the averages? And I think that's a really good point, because I think at the position player level, the differences may or may not be that big. And I think your flatter curves, like your Ben Baldwin curve, where, as you said, pick 2 is quite similar in terms of raw value as a pick 12 or a pick 15. But as a result, you get much less surplus value because you're paying more for it. But then you look at where quarterbacks have been going, and the Ringer actually did a great piece on this about how now quarterbacks are pretty much all shoved up into that first portion of the draft, and that distribution gets way wider. And especially if you're a team hunting for a quarterback, which typically the worst teams in the league are, and B, the teams that really want to get better and are likely to trade up want to do, you have to consider that distribution, Tej, and you really have to consider the upside risk as well as the downside risk, whereas when you're just looking at position players, there's not necessarily that great upside risk.
Yeah, no, that is a great point. Like, I think when you look at like research done by Michael Lopez talking about like the distribution of outcomes that Jake brought up, like the steepest draft curve that we have is your probability of finding a star, like a player who is a perennial Pro Bowler, All Pro type player, and that is much steeper than the draft curve where it looks like at the average values that we can expect from each slot. And it makes intuitive sense, right? Like when teams want to build their core of players, That's often going to happen at the top of the draft. That's usually the players that were highly athletic, highly regarded all the way from high school until they got to the NFL. And so like if you're looking for blue chip players on your roster, like that's the spot to find them. If you're looking at players that can be good to great most of the time and fill out areas of your roster without putting you behind in salary cap, like I think that's like where the next wave of picks often comes in. Like the 10 to 33 range is a lot more valuable there if that's what you're looking for.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that the current setup of how the draft is set up, both from, just the media perspective of you have your day one prospects, which probably includes the 20 best players that people think are really, really valuable, will probably start and make a huge impact day one. Then you get into kind of the later hours of day one and into day two. And that's kind of another similar class of players who are probably very good players, but have some type of flaw or medical issue, but are still expected to make an impact. And then you get into day three, or rounds 4, 5, 6, and 7, where it's kind of very flat curve, a lot of variation how people view things. And to Jake's point, the distribution is a lot smaller, but do you have a higher draft grade? And I think when we're talking about draft grades, and I think that something that Eric Eager and Thomas Dimitrov on the Sumer Sports Show do a really good job of talking about is there are a lot of personal aspects, Tej, to this. And we talk about how at least public facing draft grades kind of struggle to show a significant relationship. And, GMs over time have a struggle to get over the, 50th, 55th percentile. And some of the best to ever do it are in that range or slightly higher. But it, football is a people game. And you also, I think, really need to have a third grade alongside kind of your draft pick process management and your player evaluation, which are these kind of ungradable subjective things, Tej. And so I just have a couple questions here. I'd love to get your thoughts. Number one, is your staff happy with your picks? Number two, have you managed media and fan expectations? Number three, does the coaching staff have guys that they're excited to coach? What are your kind of thoughts on that, Tej?
I'm so glad you brought this up because this is another thing that I think is pretty under-discussed in the whole draft process. Talking to some friends at teams, post-draft and kind of like what they shared about some of their picks. Like I heard from a couple teams where it's like, yeah, like our safeties coach was really keen on this player that we took in the third round. And our GM wanted to give him the opportunity to coach this player. Or our wide receivers coach really wanted this player in the 6th round because he coached him in college and kind of knows what his skill set is. And like, I think that type of stuff is so important in the post-draft process where rounds 1 and 2, GM should, and head coach should be consulting with a lot of their staff, but that should be in their control because those are players that you really want to have an impact for you. But then it's like, everyone can kind of get their own bite at the apple later in the draft, especially on day 3, where I think you, like you mentioned, like you want to make sure your coaches are showing up and getting the opportunity to coach players that they're excited about. And I think like the Ravens had a good point about this where they have a percent chance of being available at each pick model. And so when they took Roger Rosengarten, they knew that there was an 80% chance that he was going to be there. So they didn't feel like they had to go trade up and get their guy, or they didn't have to reach to go to get, another player in that spot. Like, I think as long as you're not doing stuff like that, where you're not reaching, you're not trading up massive capital to really get players your position coaches want to, if they're available at the spot that you're picking at, and they were expected to go around that area anyways, giving your coach the opportunity to have his input and to be heard, I think can benefit everyone.
Yeah, and sticking to the rules, Tej, we talked about kind of the high level rules, but there are these kind of nuances that lend yourself to try to grow the people in your staff and the coaches in your staff. And a big part of player acquisition is the draft, and obviously the players control the outcomes of the game. And so there's this 2020 resolution JC2A in it, which came about in order to increase diversity in the coaching and staffing ranks. And we've seen the 49ers actually really take advantage of this probably not as like, a strategy, but they've really identified some great minority talent and have been able to invest in them and really build them up, whether that's through the draft, like Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, who went to the Vikings, or D'Amico Ryans, who's the head coach at the Texans now. But they've actually received compensatory picks for this.
Mm-hmm.
And so, though, like involving your staff, like building your staff up, developing your staff through these actual like draft problems or actual play problems, or allowing them to have a little bit more reign and making sure they're happy and keeping them in the building, especially if you've identified them as being a talented staffer, that actually can come back to you and have like a third round, like you could get a third round pick, which is pretty fantastic. And I'm glad that the NFL has done that, because I think not only does it improve organizations and encourage investment, but it also is kind of a tangible thing that makes you want to better your staff. And so we've kind of set up this great framework, Tej, where, first you have your player evaluation, which is, really, really difficult. The most difficult thing in football by far. Has hard to do, hard to grade, takes a long time to grade, but it probably has a great effect on winning. And then we have these things in the margins that give you more shots at the bat, which is number one, you can, manage your picks well, and you can get more shots. You can trade back and add capital later. You can look at the things that you mentioned, like surplus value and positional value and things like this, to ensure you're getting the right return in certain places. And then next, you can really just invest in your folks, and obviously very subjective, but culture. Whenever anyone cites a good organization, they cite culture and build up your coaches and really give the leeway to your scouts and make them feel as if they're part of the process and appreciate what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I'm really glad that you touched on a lot of those points and kind of like what it takes to bring up members, in the staff. And like something you told me before that, like, I think the listeners would love to hear about is like the, like how the Saints have really put an emphasis on that, where you look around the league and there's so many coaches or GMs or high ranking front office members that like were a part of the New Orleans organization at one point.
Yeah. And I think going to looking at that chart that Arjun put together, Mickey Loomis is very high on there. And obviously that's why he's had, a 20-year plus career. Yeah. But I think, and I think it's lending itself to very steady ownership. I mean, the Vincents have owned that organization for going on, I think, like 25 or 30 years now. And they have an approach, and it's pretty much worked, particularly since, 2006, 2007. Now, a lot of that is credit to Drew Brees, and a lot can get ironed over when you have the best quarterback perhaps in history, or at least a top 5 quarterback in history on your team. But they put together great defenses. They've had great running backs. They've had great wide receivers and offensive lines that have protected people. And I think a lot of that can be put forth to that they understand that the evaluation period for a GM is not necessarily 5 years. It's like 10 years, because that's 2 like really deliberate draft cycles of players coming in and out in 4-year periods. And you can kind of see that in how they hire and how they retain people. I mean, you have guys like Kai Harley, who had been there for absolute years. He's still there and is looked at as, a cap genius, someone who can really manage a lot of things. And they were kind of really early on adding in void years and getting creative with restructures and stuff like that. You also look at someone who came up through the scouting ranks, Terry Fontenot, who's now the GM at the Falcons, and has kind of a different approach where he's really based on scouting and the guys that he likes, but was crucial to some of those great draft picks that they had, Ryan Ramczyk and Kamara, Mike Thomas, all kind of. Ramczyk was a first-round pick, but like guys that they picked up in day 2 that ended up being real impact players. And I think that we're kind of starting to see that take a hold of this longer approach. And I think this is one of the high-level takeaways the listeners can take away from this, is that it's really hard to grade a draft in 1 year. It's a little easier to grade in 5 years, but it's quite easy. Like we can really get a feel in 7 years. It's just a matter of getting to that 7th year and having the patience to and trust to understand that, you know, a head coach or a general manager has his head in the right place, which is really difficult in the National Football League. But that's why we love football, because it's a game that kind of tests trust and strength and kind of the morals that we view as an American society, which is why it's America's game.
Yeah, that is true. And I mean, you do bring up the point there where it's like, yeah, if you're a GM and you take you have your full draft class, you really hope you survive your tenure as a GM to be able to see kind of like what you put all your effort into 4 years from now, but even like that like 7-8 year mark where you hope that a lot of the players you took in a draft are still playing then. But then like every GM has a different timeline, and that's really where it comes to like discounting future picks and how much we should do it. I think that we can agree that currently NFL GMs undervalue future picks. There's around like a 45-50% market discount rank, which was done by Joseph Hefner on Twitter. And he found that like there is a very strong discount rank when they're trading future picks. There's some arguments to be made that the future pick discount should be 0%, but I only think that's applicable if you're the owner of a team that's also making the decisions, because you should have as long of a tenure making decisions as you want to. I think if you're a GM where each year is a little bit more uncertain to you as if you'll have that job anymore, future picks can't be discounted 0. It has to be somewhere in between 0 and what it currently is. But I think like someone like Howie Roseman in this draft, who ended up trading for 3 future picks when, 2 on day 2 and 1 on day 3, I think he knows that he's going to be around next year to be able to use those. So he could make a lot of those trades. Kwesi Adofo-Mensah is someone who traded away a lot of future capital to move up twice to get Dallas Turner. And I think his GM tenure is a little bit more uncertain. So he puts a heavier discount on those picks when making his trade up, because he doesn't know if he'll be around to make those. So when you have that survival curve that is saying like, you have an 80% chance of being the GM next year, 60% the year after that, like that's, I think, where some of the discount can come into play. But it is clear that teams are undervaluing future picks right now just because they're trying to win in the current season. And they probably are a little bit more overconfident in how their team is actually going to perform relative to market expectations. And that's why 2 years ago, we ended up with the Lions and the Seahawks both having top 6 picks in the draft that weren't even their own, right? The Rams and the Broncos overestimated how well they were going to perform, and it ended up being huge for both of those teams.
Yeah, and if draft analysts love talking about the Eagles so much, but I think the reason why is obviously it takes a lot of talent to keep your job. But if we're just looking at sheer consistency, they've pulled the trigger on several coaches. But Jeffrey Lurie, I think, bought the Eagles in '94, so he's been there for almost 30 years now. Roseman was there during Reed's term. He was there during Peterson's term. He's now with the current head coach Sirianni. I mean, you get this consistency. And another great example is the Cowboys. People make fun of Jerry Jones all the time, but the reality is Jerry Jones has owned and been the de facto general manager of the Cowboys for 40 years, and that he's done pretty well at drafting. And as a result, you can look at kind of their decision making in this very, very long-term view. And of course, in the NFL, long-term thinking helps a lot because there's a lot of edges that the CBA can give you. And I think your kind of breakdown of discount rates is another kind of piece that we have to look at in the subjective column, because really when you're getting to your discount rate, you're really testing the limits of your job security. And that's what kind of goes into the calculation of those discount rates. And obviously there's different philosophies. Mickey Loomis had his job for 20 years and never trades back ever. It's just a philosophical thing. But it is interesting, the flexibility that having your job for longer or at least knowing that you'll have a job for 6 to 7 years can bring the approach of.
Mhm. Definitely, yeah, and, like, I think yeah, I mean, Trent Baalke was another guy in this draft where, maybe his future is a little bit more uncertain than Howie Roseman, but, like, he was someone who put an emphasis on getting future picks. Kevin Cole put out a really good, table yesterday on, like, the NFL draft surplus value added in this year's draft, and he had different columns for, the trades that you made, the positions that you took, and then how many reaches you had, and the Eagles added $22.8 million of surplus value. Trent Baalke and the Jaguars were second at 22.1. The Cowboys did a really good job with 13.4 million, and the Cardinals were also at the top there. Sorry, the Bills were at the top also with 12.2. Cardinals with 11.2 to round out the top five. So that was really good to kind of see like how some teams added value through trades, whether it's trading back a couple times like the Bills did, trading for future picks like the Eagles and Jaguars did. Like those are the edges to be had in the draft right now. And I think those GMs did a pretty good job on picking up on them.
Right. And so to summarize for the listeners, the viewers, we've done a lot of cool conversations, and I thank you, Tej, for kind of joining me on this, because I think this is a really cool thing to talk about, and something that we can really kind of build a coda of how we want to look at this as a community, as an analytics community, as a company at Sumer Sports. And that's looking at, number one is how good are you at valuing players? It's very difficult to be very good, but obviously over a long period of time, you can kind of pull away from the pack. Number two is how you manage your picks. And I'm really glad you highlighted Trent Baalke, because, that's a team that's seen ups and downs. Obviously the Khans own them. They've seen several regime changes over the Khans ownership, but he really made the decision that he was going to, buy into the long-term thinking, and hopefully it pays off for him. But it certainly looks like they have a couple good players and should have a couple more draft picks. And having Trevor Lawrence is certainly helpful, a former number one pick. And then three are these kind of subjective evaluation things of, risk tolerance based on how you feel about your job, like very subjective, really hard to grade that. We can get a sense of it, and maybe we can put like a green light, yellow light, red light grade on it, but it's really hard to tell. Am I developing the staff through my process? Am I listening? Are they happy? Like, again, very kind of up in the air thinking, but it is important that you have a happy staff, a happy coaching staff, and that those people are getting developed. And in the long term, it may actually have some tangible elements. And I think a good team to look at is the Bears here, to kind of summarize this all into one, because last year, they decided to take a long-term view despite really struggling. They traded back, gained a lot of picks, and gained a wide receiver one. Then we're able to get kind of their guy at QB1, pick one, in Caleb Williams, despite having, an okay year, like an average year for a rebuilding team. I think it was 7 wins that they won. They add a Keenan Allen. They add a couple pieces in free agency, a Montez Sweat via trade. They add a Roma Dunze at 9. And all of a sudden, people are really excited. The fans are really excited. The staff's really excited. And we felt that they performed pretty well in the draft.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think they have had like it's been, some luck has to be involved in some of this. Like I think the Falcons were a team that did have the Panthers were a team that had like a low win total last year. Getting the number one pick from that, I think was something that was a little bit lucky for the Bears, but still like an overall good process, like you mentioned, where when they were making the trade back from number one last year, they probably felt better about this year's quarterback class. Teams were probably a little bit overeager to take quarterbacks this year because of how they felt about next year's quarterback class. So all of that is intertwined. And then like picking up DJ Moore in the trade was also a really good job by Ryan Poles. And like this whole kind of process, has had good results for them. And I think like it'll be looked back on pretty favorably from the Bears perspective when it's all said and done.
I agree. Tej, this has been a fantastic conversation. I think given all the hard work, that we put in, and especially you put in on some of the writing and the draft guides and the player profiles and stuff like this. It's really good to kind of take a step back and look at how some of this stuff that we work so hard on, and some of the stuff that we cover so well ends up doing. And so I thank you for having this conversation with me. Any last words?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for bringing me on to talk about this. It was a lot of fun to go over a lot of these topics, and I appreciate you putting the notes together ahead of time when I was slacking on that. So I'm glad we were able to do it.
Yeah, all good. And if you have one takeaway from this, Sam Schwartzstein hopped in there. The takeaway here is just learn how to wait 4 years. I think that's a great summary. But given how hard it is, it causes problems, and that's why we love football, Tej.
Yes, for sure.
So from Tej Seth and Sam Bruchhaus of Sumer Sports, thank you for joining the Class Play podcast, and we hope you join us again soon. Have a good one.